think that the quality of the built environment that you live in is really, really closely related to quality of life. We think it affects your mood. We think it affects your well-being in a number of different ways. And so we really just don't believe that you know, the ability to live in a really well-designed space should be exclusive.
You're listening to the She Renovates podcast. You're listening to She Renovates, the podcast for women who want to renovate to create an income and a life they love.
Hi, it's Bernadette here. Have you been thinking about making the move from hobby renovator to professional? Do you wonder what the difference is and how you should set yourself up? Are you curious to know how to identify the right location or the right property to renovate? Or maybe you've been thinking about a joint venture. Well, the good news is that you'll find the answer to all those questions and so much more in our Renovation Bootcamp. It's open for enrolment right now. The Renovation Bootcamp is a 10-week online course that consists of 8 value-packed modules where you learn our entire system designed to generate an average of $100,000 per project. You can work through the modules at your own pace. However, there are also weekly tutorials run by myself and my team of property experts to guide you in applying the learning to your specific circumstances. The numbers are capped so that we can deliver a personal experience. And if you would like to join, please go to www.theschoolofrenovating.com/bootcamp and find out more. Let's get into today's episode. Ever since David started architecture, which is now more than a decade ago, we've had a ritual. Whenever I buy a property, we pore over the real estate floor plan and brainstorm ideas for improving its value. I have found this practice incredibly valuable. And since then, he's graduated from university, done his master's, part of which he did in Barcelona, worked for a high-end architectural practice in Sydney and established his own company. He also assists our students in the boot camp, but I've been asking him for years, how can we offer this brainstorming experience to them to access in their own businesses ongoingly? Architectural services can be cost prohibitive when you're renovating for profit, but he's come up with the perfect solution, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the solution is called the Renovators Concept Session, and it is available to everyone. So if that piques your interest, then listen in. So, welcome, David.
Thank you.
So, one of the things that I have found really helpful for the time that I've been renovating, well, certainly since you've been in the business, is that brainstorming session that we have when we first look at a project. So, you know, often it happens before it's our own. I bring the, you know, usually we sort of pore over the real estate floor plan and get that sort of high level concept plan sort of nutted out, back of the envelope type thing, in order to sort of determine, you know, what sort of improvement we can make to the flow or to the floor plan and to add value to the property. And so you have been doing that since you started uni, basically. And I guess now that you have decided to offer that as a service to renovators, I guess the first thing I want to ask you is, firstly, why? Because obviously there are bigger fish to fry, and you certainly the rest of your day is spent on larger scale, much larger scale projects. So what is it that has been the motivation for creating this service?
That's a good question, but a big question. It kind of works on there are a few different levels that we're sort of inspired to be working in this area on. At the really kind of a big scale meta level, it's about the sort of fact that there is so much housing stock in Australia that is quite old, and at least in the next couple of decades, a substantial percentage of it will be renovated. And the way that we see the architectural profession, it's really good at servicing really big projects, really good at servicing highly complex projects, and public works and large residential, new residential developments, and even really high-end, high-budget single residential projects. But it struggles when it comes to servicing much smaller scale projects. And I think that there are a couple of reasons for that. I think that one is that they're not necessarily seen to be really sort of the kinds of projects that would end up in a portfolio. So, end up on a website. And so they're not sort of the high ambition or the kind of aesthetically the high ambition projects for a lot of architects. But I think probably more significantly, or at least equally significantly, is that the process that we go through is a very detailed one, quite a laborious one, and as a result is quite expensive. So I think it's the majority of the industry really struggles to service much smaller projects because of the cost of what's involved in actually doing the work that we do. And we think that's a reasonably significant problem in the context of this idea that so many people are living in properties that will be renovated at some point. And we think that the quality of the built environment that you live in is really, really closely related to quality of life. We think it affects your mood. We think it affects your well-being in a number of different ways. And so we really just don't believe that the ability to live in a really well-designed space should be exclusive. We think that it's something which should be kind of more broadly accessible. And we think that at this point, one of the main inhibitors to that is just that our process is quite rigid. So we've sort of been looking at ways of how we can break that process down to what's really essential in the kind of design process, and build it back up on the scale of a small scale renovation. So we think that the process that's involved in designing an award-winning freestanding building in the CBD is actually not that dissimilar to the design process, and the kind of applicability of that design process really translates when you break it down to what's totally essential in designing a building or designing a renovation. And what we've sort of come to conclude in really thinking quite a bit about that and thinking about how you break that down is that it's really all about a clear strategy. So we think that a clear design strategy is what makes an award-winning project award-winning, and we think a clear design strategy is what makes a great renovation great. And you can spend a huge amount of money on a project with no clarity to the design strategy and build something that is perfectly terrible, or you can spend a very small amount of money on something which has a really clear design strategy and deliver something which is a great piece of design. So we just don't think that budget is the key limiting factor in great design. We think that it really comes down to the clarity of the strategy, and we've been looking at how we can.
For us mere mortals, what does that mean?
Okay. So for instance, I've worked on my fair share of projects which you would sort of put in the category of potential award-winning projects, the kinds of things that we aspire to put into the architectural awards. And for those types of projects, you know, the strategy can be something related to, say, the formal impact of the building. So for instance, you know, having a really high impact in the street could be an essential part of the design strategy if that building needs to have an identity. So one of the projects that I was lucky enough to deliver a couple of years ago, and which did win a number of awards, it had a big part of the design strategy was this idea that the building's experience in the round. And so the building is, you know, it really kind of reaches out into the street, and it's a curved building that sort of has these awnings that extend out into the street or out over the sort of pavement. And it really is experienced in the round and clad in quite a kind of dominating finish that is this charred steam bent timber. And so on a project like that, the design strategy, which is this idea of a building in the round, a high impact building that has a kind of iconic status in its locality, that's how we start to talk about design strategy on that type of a project. On a project like say, if we're talking about a residential renovation where we're you know, potentially reworking a kitchen and bathroom and interconnecting it with other spaces within an existing apartment. That design strategy, we think, in residential design comes down to two or falls broadly within two brackets or two areas. One is about how you move through a space, and the other is how a space feels. So it's kind of on that really high level, we think about it as being about stillness and movement. And to put it into terms that are probably used a lot more in the field of renovating, it's kind of about the flow of the space and the feeling of the space. So that kind of movement and the atmosphere of space. So we think that that kind of forms the framework of a really clear design strategy when it comes to residential renovations, particularly the spatial components of a residential renovation. And, you know, if we kind of break that down within the flow of a space, within the movement of a space, you're looking at things like how one space connects to another, you know, the size of the opening between the kitchen and the dining room, for instance, and the adjacency of spaces. You might look to shift a dining room, swap a dining room with another room so that it has a better adjacency with the kitchen, or shift the kitchen so it's got a better adjacency with the rear yard. So it's kind of, that's one aspect of it, is the adjacency of spaces. Another aspect of it is how you physically move through those spaces. So the placement of a door in a room is one of the kind of key tenets that we keep coming back to in our practice. We really think that the placement of a door in a room can completely transform the way that a room is used. And it's such a kind of small, granular level of design focus that it can totally transform the feeling of a space and how you move through it. And even sometimes the direction that a door swings in a room can totally transform a room. So we think that, you know, you can really scale that level of design and strategic thinking down to that level. Some of the other aspects of movement come down to where you place furniture in a room, the proportions of the space. You know, these things all kind of form how a space feels to move through it. If we look at for some examples of what the atmosphere, how you generate atmosphere in a space and how you kind of design the atmosphere of a space, or what it is to be still in a space, we think about things like the proportions of the space again. So, you know, the ceiling height, the width and the length of the room, that really defines a lot of how a space feels. If your space has a really high ceiling height, it will have a totally different feeling to a space that has a really low ceiling height. So a really kind of long and narrow room with a low ceiling height has a totally different feeling to a space that has, say, the same ceiling height but is much shorter. So proportions of space, got things like natural light, artificial light, material selections, all of these things that kind of define the way that a space feels while you're still in it.
Yeah.
So
a good example of the just changing the way the door swings was the Rennie Street project.
Yep.
That was one of those tiny little terraces where you step straight into the living room, and it was
Yep.
like the whole place was 60 square meters. And because the door opened against the room, so you didn't actually see the room as you opened the door, the whole place looked small. But when we swung it the other way, the minute you opened the door, you saw this full expanse of 3 rooms right to the back of the house, and it made a massive difference to that sense of size. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I think that sometimes it's surprising how small of a change can have such a significant impact on the outcome.
And as a renovator, you know, like going through open inspections, you see some improvements, I'll use that in inverted commas, that have been done to properties and obviously have had no skilled design applied to them, and they look amateur, they look dodgy, and you know, rooms, and I'm going to come really clean now and say, in our really early days, before you came on the scene, I think that some of our floor plan changes and things that we did were not great. And I think what you're doing with this service is actually getting to the project at that very early stage and setting it on the right course. Yeah,
definitely. But I think that one of the things that we think about in that context is this idea of the, you know, Pareto's law, that the 20% of your input yields 80% of the results. And we really think that's especially true at the beginning of a project, that you can do a very, very, very small amount of kind of design work very early in a project, set it on the right course. And in some instances, especially with your students who have got, you know, a very high level of training in how to deliver a renovation, and they even have a reasonably good idea of how to design and how to, you know, deliver a design without necessarily having a kind of full and detailed set of drawings. In that context, we think that we can actually do very, very, very small parts of projects and assist and guide in those very early stages of a project, and have a massive positive impact on the design outcome. And that also, I mean, that's also a part of why I am quite motivated about working in this way, is because I sort of think that if I was to commit the next 10 years of my career working on projects that might be perceived as having the potential of being submitted to you know, the biggest architectural awards that there are, I might be able to feasibly deliver 2 or 3 of those projects in the next 10 years. But I think that if I'm equally able to focus on much, much smaller projects that may only require half a day or a day's work from me, I can actually potentially deliver or have a part in bringing about a 10 or 20 or even 50% change, positive change in hundreds of projects. And I think that, you know, if I could do 1,000 projects in my career, I'd be in a much happier place than if I could do 10. So I think that's on a basic metric level, I think that interests me as well.
Excellent. So, well, we're definitely the beneficiaries of that decision. So I meant to jump in earlier and say that the project that you were talking about was Barangaroo House.
It was.
And it's in no way resembles any renovation that any of us will ever do, but it's worth having a look at. Very interesting building, and we'll include a link in the show notes. And so let's just talk about,
that project was delivered with, I was the project architect at Collins and Turner Architects. So not in my own name, which I think is a important distinction to make, but yeah, it's very lucky to have been able to work on a number of projects like that have really made it quite clear to me that there's a real value in taking the level of design thinking that you apply to a project like that and scaling it right down and using that strategic design process on much smaller projects.
Yeah. Like, I've been doing this, as you know, for nearly 30 years. And it always amazes me because I'll come up with how I think the floor plan should work. And then I show it to you and you just completely turn it on its head. And often the things that you come up with, the ideas that you come up with, require less work than what I was planning. And they're just it's much simpler or something, but I think there's a real simplicity about your designs that give them, a lot of appeal. And certainly as a renovator, I think in most cases are quite easy to deliver.
I appreciate that perspective. I also think that I'm lucky to have been in a situation of having developed this process organically by working effectively with you and other renovators right there at the sketch pad with us, because that's actually a really important part of how we're building this tool moving forward, is that we know that if we were to take a design brief, prepare some drawings and bring them back to you, that we can deliver a design that is going to work in a lot of ways, and that we think is going to, it's going to be we think that we can make a great design out of just about any space. But what a great design is to you is going to be different to what a great design is to us. And we can still work with all of the compliance aspects, and we can design spaces that are really functional, but still have, say, three or four options within that kind of design within the context of the existing building. And so by having the renovator with us while we're preparing that design concept, we can sort of close the feedback loop, rather than preparing a drawing and issuing it and then having some comments and then coming back and doing this to and fro 4 or 5 times, which is just frankly expensive, because it's more time that we need to spend doing more drawings and going through that feedback process. If we physically do the designs in the same space or by Zoom, which is how we're currently delivering the product, if we do that in that same kind of video conference space, we can actively develop it together and effectively bring the renovator to the drawing table with us, which we think is a really important part of our process.
Yeah, it's I was talking to, so prior to launching this, we'll call it a product. It's called the Renovators Concept Session, just for that, and we'll talk about the details in a minute. But you tested it quite extensively on quite a few of our students. And I was talking to one the other day, and you had done this plan on their family home. And what he said was that what you did in, 45 minutes or an hour, firstly, it was clear that you had spent time on it before he got there, that you had prepared well for it. And secondly, that you were able to bring a clarity in 45 minutes that they had not been able to manage in 9 months of struggling, trying to decide what they were going to do with the space. So I think that's a really, powerful testament to the value of the Renovators Concept Session.
I think that project, which I think that project's a really great example of why we think it's so important to have the renovator at the drawing table with us, because I had prepared, as we always prepare for these sessions. So I had prepared in the sense that I'd reviewed the plans and I had some ideas about how you might go about, restructuring that space, but we almost never come to those sessions with drawings. So we'll come with the existing floor plan, but we won't actually start that session by talking through our design proposal. We will have thought about what's the smallest intervention that you could possibly make in that space and have a huge impact. And then we'll think about what's the brief effectively, because in our sign up process for the Renovator Concept tool, it is a briefing form. So it's, quite specific about how it asks quite specific questions about how you want to redesign the space. And then, so that's the kind of middle ground. And then we'll think, if we were to completely throw the brief out and just look at what's the ultimate outcome for this floor plan, and we'll put some thought into what each of those three phases are, the minimum, the middle ground, and the ultimate, so that when it comes to having conversations with, or when it comes to that actual workshop session, and, you know, we're kind of throwing ideas around, or especially if the renovators throwing questions to us about, you know, how else could we do this? What if we did that? We've actually kind of already looked outside of the scope of the kind of tunnel vision of the project, if you'll call it that. And so because I didn't have a drawing when I came to that, I could have definitely, I had a fairly clear idea of what I thought was their perfect on brief floor plan before I walked into that workshop session. But it actually was better for us having brought a completely open mind to it and allowed their input to drive it. So the final outcome was, I would say, significantly better than the outcome that I would have developed in complete isolation of the renovator. And I think a part of the reason for that is that often the renovators that we're working with have lived in the spaces, so they can give us immediate feedback about, you know, exactly what that space feels like at a certain time of day, or exactly why that you know, what does or doesn't feel quite right, which, you know, we can understand the space as much as we can possibly give it by kind of interrogating the floor plan and some photos, but we can't know a space the same way that a renovator can know it if they've lived in it, or a homeowner or first home buyer. So yeah, we really do think that process is hugely important. I don't think that there's been a project that we've done yet where it's been just a one-way street of just us driving the design, and it's always better off for it.
Yeah, and and particularly when you're renovating for profit, you have some quite clear parameters that you need to, you know, follow, and so I think that's very useful. And before we get into just talking about the detail of the service, I wanted you to tell the audience the process to become an architect, because I think personally, until I saw what you went through, I wasn't really clear on the value of architecture. And well, I guess I was in a big iconic sense, but I wasn't in terms of everyday design. And I wasn't really sure. You know, you think about people drawing floor plans and whatever, and I wasn't really sure about, you know, the difference between you and me in terms of, you know, what created that difference. But now, obviously, I can see we're poles apart, and I think it's really valuable for people to know, because I often say, if you want design, you've got to go to an architect, even if you don't have the architect manage the project, which I personally think is where a lot of the expense is. Do you want to just quickly outline what it takes to be an architect?
Yes, that's a reasonably big question again, but well, broadly speaking, it involves 5 years of study, 3 years of undergraduate, 2 years of postgraduate, and then a minimum of 2 years of working in practice before you can get registered as an architect. So architect is a legislatively defined term in each state, and so you have to be registered in each state that you want to work in as an architect. But I think that what's specific about that process, as opposed to, say, a building designer or a draftsperson, is that the study that you do, so the all the way through those 5 years of the degree, there are obviously some technical aspects to what we're learning. There are a lot of technical aspects to what we're learning, but every single semester, a quarter, if not half of the course load is based on developing design strategy. So they're called design studio, and everyone pours countless hours into design studio, because that's really where you're learning how to design effectively. And I think that really only comes, that kind of design ability, that capacity for design really only comes through, it's a learnt skill. It's not, I don't think that it's something that you're either born with or not. I think that you develop a vocabulary for design as the more that you do it. And so I think that, those 5 years are actually kind of essential, because it just takes that long to develop your own kind of language and process for how it is that you go about designing. And I think that's probably one of the most important components. I mean, obviously the technical aspects of it are totally critical, and the 2 years working in the profession before you can get registered are mostly about the technical and legal aspects of practicing as an architect. And for most people, that 2 years is more like 5 or 6 years, or for some 10 years. So it's quite a lengthy process, and we're held to very, very stringent standards by the Architects Registration Board, which is the kind of mechanism for protecting the consumer from architects that might not be performing in a way that's consistent with the code of conduct. So in a sense, it's engaging an architect is a highly protected position to take if you're working, especially on a very, very complex project. It's a highly protected position to take as a consumer, but is also obviously a part of why it can be very expensive to engage an architect, because there's quite a bit of legislation around how we can and can't act, and that does come at a sort of cost of time and energy. At times.
What I don't get, this is just off on a slight tangent, but we'll get back on the track in a minute. Why aren't builders and developers held to the same standard?
Well, builders go through quite a stringent process, I would say, in order to get a builder's license. It's a trade-based process rather than a design-based process, and a kind of, it's a different approach to learning the technical components, but I think they are held to a fairly high standard. But in the same way that you have some builders out there that are not really performing at the level that they're legislatively required to do, it's the same. It would be the same in every profession, in every industry. So, I mean, there are certainly some architects out there that
Dodgy.
I'm not sure if I'd say that, but I'm not sure if I can say that.
Oh, well, I can, so there you go. Okay, so let's talk about the service, and then, so it's called the Renovators Concept Session, and when someone books in for a session, firstly, how much do they pay for the session?
So it is $360 plus GST, so I think that works out at $396. It is a part of the way that we've built the tool is really about absolutely minimizing the amount of time that we need to spend doing admin tasks, like preparing a brief and understanding the brief and all of these things that, again, they just make the process expensive for the consumer, which if we're trying to figure out how we make this as cheap as we possibly can, it's really about cutting the fat that we don't need to be spending time on. So we've automated the sign-up process. We've got an online briefing form, and we've automated the payment of it so that we don't need to be chasing invoices. So it's kind of that's kind of fits into a whole sort of ecosystem of how we can deliver the maximum value, because it's actually not just about it being cheap. It's about making sure that as much time as we can possibly spend on the project is spent designing rather than doing admin. So the sign up is done through an online form, and at the completion of that form and the completion of the payment, it will prompt the person who's signing up to the program to select a date for the workshop session. Upon selecting the date for the workshop session, you'll get an email confirming it, and that's going to have the link to the Zoom session in that email. And so basically, before we've spent time kind of really getting our heads into the project, we've already got the whole kind of timeline of the project, or of that part of the project locked in. It's in both of our calendars, and all the renovator has to do at that point is show up. So as a part of the workshop sign up form, the online form, it will prompt the renovator to upload a floor plan, And that could be an existing floor plan from a previous renovation, or it could be a floor plan from the sale of or purchase of a property. And more often than not, they are the marketing floor plans that are used for marketing the property putting the property on the market. And we will, between the renovator signing up to the course and us meeting for the workshop, we'll, as I mentioned earlier, sort of start to figure out what's the minimum intervention that we would do on that floor plan. What is it that we think is the kind of optimal design outcome based on the brief that they've given us, and what's the kind of maximum and ultimate scheme for that floor plan within reason. I mean, you know, we're not going to propose to add a level to a building or to a house where someone's looking to renovate the kitchen. But, you know, sometimes you'll identify that shifting, you know, taking out an extra wall or swapping the kitchen and the dining room will just totally transform the feeling of the space and totally transform the house. And that may be out of budget, but it doesn't mean that it's not worth having a conversation about, because, you know, budget is also, especially for those who are renovating for profit, budget is totally dependent on the added value of the renovation.
Exactly.
So
so if you can
sometimes
add
an extra,
then often you can spend more.
Yeah, and like I don't claim to be an expert in what a property's, you know, how much value you can add to a property by doing a certain aspect of the renovation. But we know that the renovators are well trained in that. They've got the training from the course that they're doing with you, or from previous experience. And so we can at least give them all the information that we know about design, and we can guide the design into a direction that works for them.
And so then once you've got those three sort of concepts, you then meet with, they're in your head, you haven't actually got them on paper yet.
Exactly. Yeah. So then we will kind of bring those ideas to the meeting. But as I said, we don't actually bring drawings to the meeting because we want to develop that drawing one-on-one in that kind of workshop session. And as I said before, the benefit of that is there are so many aspects to the benefit of that. But one of the main benefits is that we get that immediate input, that immediate feedback as we're going. And we can really, we think that is hugely valuable to both the design and to the time spent on the project. You know, we don't want to be developing 3 or 4 or 5 options if we only really need to develop one and just get the immediate feedback as we're going. It's that kind of like flow and stream of consciousness between us and the renovator in that process.
Okay. And so then once you've finished the session, what happens? Do they get the designs then? So you've got an iPad where you can draw on the screen so everyone can see.
Sorry, I should have clarified that. Yes.
Yeah.
So basically in that Zoom session, I'll share the screen of the iPad to the meeting, and I'll just be effectively drawing live and developing the floor plan in hand sketch form in that meeting. And following that meeting, it's usually a kind of like semi-messy floor plan that we've got at the end of that meeting, because we're sort of fleshing out there's so many different ideas, and, you know, shifting a pantry there or opening a wall up there and moving things around quite a bit. And so by the end of that meeting, I'll usually take that drawing away for a few hours and just tidy it up and really kind of try to clarify all of the scope that we've described, so that at the end of that meeting, they'll get a hand-drawn PDF floor plan, which covers all of the scope that we've discussed and covers those really kind of big gestures that are structuring the concept and the design strategy for the project. From there, it depends a little bit on what type of project it is. So for some projects, you know, for a really small scale kitchen and bathroom renovation, it's not necessarily essential to have a CAD drafted floor plan, and that hand sketch might actually be enough, and often is in fact enough for the renovator to take it and start scoping the project up and take it to, say, a kitchen designer, and take it to an engineer if they need to have structural engineering done. On some projects, we would, you know, the next kind of step up from that would really be for us to prepare a CAD drafted floor plan if it's necessary for the project. And we've sort of really just broken our services right down into a modular setup like that, so that we can build it up as we need to for projects that need it. Or also, you know, where we, as I said before, really feel that if we can spend that kind of 5 or 10% of time on a project and have a huge impact on the rest of the project, we're perfectly happy for the renovator to take that sketch and have somebody else deliver it. So like if they have a draftsperson that they use for all of their projects. We're perfectly happy for them to take it to them and deliver it that way. So it's not, we have those services there if they're necessary for the project and to streamline it for the renovator, because it's really what we want to be able to do is to assist renovators in them delivering the project. But yeah, it's not essential for every project. Sometimes that hand sketch session is plenty for them to
I think
the project.
it's important to stress that what you leave with is it might be 1, 2, or maybe 3 options, but they're hand sketch, they're a concept, they're not working plans. And if you do need to go to that next step, you can either take it to your draftsman or builder, or you can get a Thurlow studio to quote on the next step of the work, so that you've got options. But
importantly, you're not having somebody, whether it's us or somebody else, draft up a floor plan, which you're then going to have to modify the design for several times as you go, because you've already worked the design out. So we just think that designing while you're drafting is a terrible format for low cost work. Like it's sometimes totally essential to draft it and then continue developing the design as you go. But especially on small projects, it's a very, very expensive way to work. So if you can develop the design before you get there.
It uses different parts of your brain. Designing is the creative part. The drafting is the technical part. They're two different.
And that's exactly why it's sometimes necessary to develop the design as you kind of move into the CAD drafting arena, because sometimes, in fact, if not almost always, as you prepare a CAD drafted floor plan, the technical issues start to arise. And some of those kind of technical challenges of how we're going to resolve this particular aspect of it starts to arise. And so you sometimes do need to develop that design as you go. But for a lot of very small projects, that often happens on site. That's often, those technical aspects are often resolved on site. So it depends a lot on the project.
Awesome. Well, I think we have fleshed it out. Just important to mention that for our students, when they come into the boot camp, David actually comes in and does a session with the group, and basically you can bring your floor plans in and he will do them live in the tutorial. And then if you want to use it outside the tutorial and you're in one of our programs, you just get in touch with our office and you will get a coupon to use, which is very generous of Thurlow Studios. So thank you very much. And so that's the Renovators concept session. And I know that it's going to make a massive difference to our community and the renovating community at large. So thanks for coming on today. And all the details plus the link to book a Renovators concept session will be in the show notes. And as I mentioned, if you're in one of our programs now, just get in touch with admin at the School of Renovating, Judy, and she will organise a code for you. And that's it. So thanks,
awesome.
David.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
No worries. Take care.
Well, that's it for today's episode. Now, we've covered a lot, and you'll find the links to everything we've talked about in the show notes. And also, if you haven't already done it, we would love it if you would head over to iTunes and leave us a review. We read every one of them, and it just makes such a difference to know that we are having an impact on your life and your renovating. So for those of you who've already left reviews, thank you so much, and see you all next week.
This is the She Renovates podcast. To discover how to harness the power of renovating, check out theschoolofrenovating.com.